This episode is brought to you by Mojo. Performance-enhancing services make people faster, smarter, and more effective as human beings. And Mojo is the world's most powerful. With Mojo, you can plan out your next move, tackle your next challenge, and accomplish your next goal. That's why people that use Mojo are in better shape, make more money, and have better relationships. And teams that use Mojo have higher performance, better cultures, and more talented people. So if you want to optimize your performance and well-being in 2022, try out Mojo risk-free at joinmojo.com. That's 14 days absolutely free at joinmojo.com.
Well, hello, everybody. This is David Naylor with the Motivational Intelligence Podcast. I've got Shawn Johnson with me here today, and we have a very, very phenomenal guest, incredibly interesting gentleman with a background that you rarely find in people, and an incredible story about how it all came together. So his name is Al West. Now, Al will tell us a little bit, I'm sure, about his upbringing and whatnot, but I'll tell you a little bit about his professional side of things. He is one of the rare individuals who was part of a unicorn company, internet startup. He was the fifth employee in the organization, actually built the sales team for the organization. So he got to see the inside of a rapidly growing software company and all of the learning that came from that. So we've got a very cool conversation today. So Al, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to tell my story.
Yeah. So Al, I actually wanted to start, one of the things that you notice when you study very successful people is they typically will have a very clear, crystal clear driver. And a lot of times that is kind of what pushes them to continually improve. And a lot of times it comes from their upbringing. So I kind of wanted to start there. Could you tell us a little bit about your childhood and maybe how that shaped you?
Sure. Thanks, Shawn. I do think that has a big part in who I am. And of course, everybody brings their history along with them. And it's something that we all have to deal with in one way or another. We kind of drag it around and it follows us whether we want it to or not. So going back to the beginning, I guess we'll start there. I was born in the 60s, and I was the result of a relationship between two people where they just weren't ready to have children. And that happens a lot. But my mother had an accident and was actually told that she could not have children. And I was the first of four. So never believe when doctors tell you it's an impossibility, and things can happen even when it's supposed to be impossible. But my two parents were not ready for children. And so shortly after I was born, they tried to make a go of it, but they kind of went their separate ways and just delivered me to my grandmother. And this would be my father's mother. And she took me over when I was 3 months old and started to raise me. And when I was 4 years old, my biological mother came back into the fold. My grandmother and grandfather were about to pack up and leave Los Angeles, California, a very nice, affluent suburb in California. And they were about to pack everything up and leave it behind. They were tired of the traffic, the smog, and just the whole rigmarole of Los Angeles. I've been there numerous times. That's where I was born. But they were ready to pack it up and go home. And home for my grandfather was Louisiana, of all places. To go from one LA to the other LA was to go from Los Angeles to Louisiana, two very different places. And I remember the first memory of my childhood is just crying to my mother to let me go. I didn't want to be with her. She was kind of a stranger to me, quite frankly, after being with my grandparents for all of my life up to 4 years old. And so she let me go. We packed everything up, and it's really funny that we did a reverse Beverly Hillbillies. If you've ever seen the Beverly Hillbillies, they left the hills of Kentucky or somewhere in Appalachia in their shack when they hit it big in oil and moved to California and to Beverly Hills, actually. And we didn't move from Beverly Hills, but we were an affluent family in a middle-class suburb, living the dream. My grandfather was an aircraft mechanic at Hughes Aircraft, and he basically said, one day we're going home. And so we packed it all up and moved to Louisiana. And home for him was actually a shack, just like the Beverly Hillbillies had moved away from. So we literally did the reverse of the Beverly Hillbillies.
Wow.
And when I say shack, it was very much a shack. Let me describe it to you. And one day I'll send a picture so you'll get a visual. Maybe we'll post it with the podcast or something. But this shack was 3 rooms. And it was something that my grandfather's brother had given to him because it was something that they'd lived in for a short period of time until they built another house. But it had no indoor running water whatsoever. So we're talking about the outhouse, and we had to carry water in jugs from our neighbor, which was his mother, my grandfather's mother, my great grandmother. So we basically found ourselves in a situation with 3 rooms, no indoor plumbing, and in very tight quarters, obviously. So I slept in the bedroom with my grandparents, and we lived there from the time I was 4 years old until I was 9. So for 5 years, I lived in those kind of conditions. And, I didn't know much different. I knew we had a bathroom with running water and all the luxuries in California. But, soon afterwards, moving to Louisiana was a big adventure, going out in the woods and, just being your nearest neighbor is a half a mile away. And everything was just a new adventure for me. So didn't know any different that conditions were bad, but I did realize that I was poor, and we stayed poor because my grandfather went to work for the local county government, which they call parishes in Louisiana, and drove a dump truck, and probably didn't make much because we didn't have much all the way through the rest of the time that I lived with them. And I remember when I was 9 years old, we bought another house, or he bought another house. And I remember that they bought it, a house and 3 acres from his aunt and uncle who had recently died, from the estate of his aunt and uncle, for $5,000. Now, he probably got a deal, but the house wasn't that much. It was a frame house, probably built back in the 1940s. And it was older. But let me tell you, it had 6 rooms, 3 bedrooms, and those 6 rooms, and it also had indoor plumbing. Now, we did have electricity in the old house that didn't have indoor plumbing, but this was an upgrade for us. But you know what? I was still poor, and I felt like I knew I was poor. And at some point in time when I was living in the old house that had no indoor running water or indoor plumbing, I remember saying to myself very clearly that I will not be poor when I grow up. And that has been a motivating factor for me, because most people have not lived that poor. And it certainly had an impact on me. And I remember clearly saying to myself, I will not be poor when I grow up. And that was my biggest motivating factor. And fear motivates you, but I don't know that this was a fear of being poor, but I just remember I would not be poor when I grew up. And I didn't even know what the opposite of poor was, but anybody who had indoor, running water was not poor in my book.
Yeah. So relative to the other people that you were going to school with, I imagine it was probably a fairly small school. And so was the level of poverty fairly equal across the community, or were you going to school with kids who were significantly, better off than you guys were?
I don't know anybody that I went to school with that didn't have indoor running water. Mm-hmm. And so that put me at the bottom of the barrel. And when we moved into the home that had the running water, it wasn't like I was exactly on even par. The people that I hung with throughout school and into high school, I mean, they were all considerably more affluent. They were definitely, middle class, some of them upper middle class, but nobody had it nearly as bad as, not having any indoor running water. And I knew that I was at the bottom of the barrel when it came to being poor. And so hard to top that.
Yeah. So Elle, how did you, obviously to go from growing up that way to, making your way in a high-tech startup, how did you make the transition from there to being able to go on to college and get an education and, on that side of things?
So that's a good part of the story. I remember going from the 8th grade into high school, that conversation where you sit down with your guidance counselor going into high school, and your guidance counselor. Now, my grandmother was in the conversation. This was the year before she died. And she's in the conversation with me and the guidance counselor. And the guidance counselor said, if Alston, that's my proper name, had only applied himself, he would have been in the top 20 of his graduating class going into high school. It was about 120 people. And I was like, yeah, no problem. And my grandmother was like, stopped the conversation, looked at me, and she said, you better listen carefully here, because if you don't, you're not going to go to college and you're going to end up being just like your cousins. And boy, that was the slap across the bow for me. That scared me straight as an arrow. And I took that to heart, because my cousins that I had grown up with, they were poor, but they didn't try to apply themselves. They didn't really, any of them really, except for one of my cousins had tried, and he was the youngest of my cousins, but my first cousins, they just didn't really try and didn't make much of themselves. And there was the employment conditions around where I grew up in a small town in North Louisiana was not that great. So she really scared me straight. And from that point on, I was like, okay, I'm going to try to make straight A's. And I mean, I bared down. It wasn't like it came easy to me. I had to spend extra time studying, but it's like something switched in me, and that motivation, that motivating that I will not be poor. I knew if I didn't go to college, I didn't have much of a chance of breaking out of this. So I bared down. And in high school, my GPA was 3.96, which means I made 1B, and we got report cards every 6 weeks. And in order to make an A, you had to have a 94 average on all of your schoolwork. And one of those 6-week periods, I had a B, and it was a 93. I missed it by 1 point. And I was pretty devastated, but I ended up getting a pretty good scholarship into a local engineering school that I applied to, Louisiana Tech University.
Wow.
So Al, was this something, you mentioned early on, looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, I will not be poor. And then kind of that same motivating factor coming up again with your grandmother and getting your grades in line. How conscious of that driver were you growing up? And is it something like, as you got into your career, did you find yourself going back there to kind of tap that well of motivation consciously? Or was it something that was kind of happening in the background that maybe you weren't consciously aware of it yet?
No, I was very consciously and subconsciously aware of this motivational driving force. And it certainly was a driving force, because that changed my behavior, 8th grade going into 9th grade. And it stayed with me throughout my entire life. And I wouldn't call it a fear of being poor, but it just was a driving force. And there's always times in life when you face adversity, when it's hard to keep going, and you look for the motivation to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just keep going forward. And that's always been that driving force deep within, whether it's conscious or subconscious. It was always that driving force to keep me moving and to keep going, in a direction that would help me to achieve those results.
So you very clearly applied it, in academia and getting into college. How did that translate, into getting your career started? How did you use that?
Well, in getting my career started, I actually ended up having to drop out of college. And that was a very difficult moment, but it was the result of my grandfather at that point being in bad health and having to help him through a very difficult time in his life from a health standpoint, and also just being thrust into the workforce earlier than I wanted to. So my senior year of college, I left early, and it was one of those things that I was never able to go back and finish it up. And it bothers me to a certain degree, but at the same time, I kind of think I'm not in bad company with the likes of Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Wozniak, and others who have been able to be successful without having that 4-year degree. But I thought I wanted to program computers. That's what I thought I had found a passion for. And when I got out into the workforce, I one thing to do it in college, but when you get into the workforce and you start doing it on a day in and day out basis, I didn't realize just how, number one, it wasn't appealing to me. It became a very boring and mundane job for me. And I wasn't the greatest gifted person when it comes to writing code. It was very, very boring to me. I was maintaining somebody else's code and making some changes to it. And I remember one day my boss coming to me and noticing that I wasn't doing too good at coding. And he basically promoted me. Now, I don't suggest this is a good thing, but it's kind of a funny thing going back, that you're not good at writing code, but hey, I'm gonna have you do this other job over here, which is it was called a database analyst. And I was like, okay, what is that exactly? And basically it was the keeper of the files. And I gravitated towards that and did a much better job at database work than just grunt coding, what I would call grunt coding. And sorry if I offend anybody out there, but it just wasn't for me. And I was better at that, but I still had not found my calling. And this is only a few years into doing this that a friend of mine I met up with was doing very well for himself. He had the nice car, he had a lot of neat things going. And, he came up to me and was asking how I was doing. I'm like, I'm doing pretty good. I'm a database analyst. And he's like, oh yeah, I'm just a sales guy. Oh, really? Yeah, I'm doing okay. And what do you mean by okay? And he's like, tell me how much he was making. And it literally was 5 times what my salary was as a database analyst. I'm like, wait a minute, my ears must be clogged up. You said this number and it was 5 times the number of what I was making. And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, no way, come on. Yeah, I don't believe you. And he's like, yeah, check it out. Here's my W-2. So he showed me his W-2 and I immediately said, wow, I'm on the wrong side of the business. Can you hook me up? And the rest is history. He's like, sure, I'll get you an interview with my boss. And, if you think you really think you'd want to be in sales. And I'm like, hey, money motivates me. I'm very motivated by that. So the rest, as they say, is history.
Wow. So what was that conversation like with his boss? You're coming from the programming side. How did you convince this individual that, hey, no, I can sell in addition to managing the database?
Well, that was not easy. I expected it to be easy because I'm like, hey, if you're a basketball coach and you've played basketball, wouldn't you be a better coach? And they didn't get it. I mean, it was almost like these people selling technology was their own little secret society with their own little secret handshakes. And it wasn't easy to convince his boss to take a chance on me. But I wouldn't say at that point in time I was the most outgoing person, but it's interesting how I think you can reconstruct your DNA. Mm-hmm. I honestly do. If the motivation is deep enough, you're not an outgoing person, but you know that you have to become that person to achieve what you want. I became that person. I turned it on. I found it. I don't know how I was able to reconstruct my DNA, but if it's something that you truly desire enough, I think that things can fall into place. And I really wanted this. I was motivated by my friend and I was motivated by the money at that point. And so that allowed me to put that together and be very persistent. I would not call myself a persistent person up to that point, but this was something that I truly wanted. And I went after it with everything in me. It was my desire of my heart. And I convinced him to take a chance on me.
Well, that's, it's always in the want to that people discover the how to. So you had big want to.
What was the learning curve like in getting started in sales?
Well, that's an interesting question. To me, I've always felt like sales, initially, I looked down on it, to be honest with you. I really did. I looked down on sales. And for the first year, I was extremely apologetic, calling on people that I used to be on their side of the business. And I would explain, hey, I used to be on your side. I was a techie. I managed the database. But now I've got some technology that can help you solve a business problem. And a peer of mine on the sales side who'd been selling for many years basically sat me down and said, hey, you've got to stop apologizing. You're offering a valuable service here. Your time is valuable, first and foremost. Your knowledge is valuable, and you're helping them solve a complex business problem. And you know how to articulate that value of what our solution does. And so that person taking the interest to set me down and teach me how to sell. There aren't many places you can go to learn how to sell. There's only a few universities that have degrees in sales. There's a lot of companies or universities that offer business degrees, general business degrees, but I only know of about 5 in the entire country that you can go get a degree in selling or sales. So there is a lot of school of hard knocks when it comes to sales, unfortunately, and it's not just common sense. There really is a lot of psychology. But I think the technical foundation that I had really helped me to apply and learn my niche very, very well and become a master of the craft because I'm selling technology. I couldn't envision myself selling anything else. But technology and applying that to solve business problems, it truly was my passion. And that's the thing that I've told not only my children, but other people that I talk to that are trying to figure out what to do in life. Find your passion, because if you do, it will be rewarding, but also you'll never work a day in your life.
Yeah. So, Al, were you relatively successful quickly when you came into sales, or was that something where there were the lean years in that as well? But that was that passion that kept you fighting through those lean years.
Well, the first year was lean. There was a lot of learning to do. And I remember basically moving from Louisiana, where I was working on the tech side, and I moved to this company in New Jersey. And that was a big move. Culturally, it was culture shock going from Louisiana again now into Jersey. But hey, I was more than willing to do whatever it took if it meant moving, with the eye of, hey, eventually I'm going to get back down south, probably Atlanta, because it's a technology hub. But that first year in Jersey with the company that I went to work for, things were going pretty smooth until about 6 months in. I get a call from the boss. He's like, come into my office. And I was just getting up to speed. I had a pipeline and I had a few deals. I closed one deal, but I hadn't achieved my quota yet. And it was like, okay, we're going to put you on a plan. And I'm like, okay, what's a plan? He's like, well, if you don't make your quota by the end of the month, we're going to have to let you go. And I'm thinking, 6 months in, you're going to let me go? You're okay? Huh. So I thought, this is not good. I mean, here I am. I've made this investment in myself. I've moved across the country. I'm dealing with these cultural differences. First of all, let me figure out a way to make my quota, because I had a pipeline. So I got on my bike and started figuring out how to close these deals, and was fortunate enough to, guess what? I made my quota. But at that same afternoon, I went home, thought about it, put together a plan, and said, you know what? This company doesn't really want me very badly. I'm going to call our biggest competitor, cold called a sales manager at our biggest competitor and said, hey, I'm interested in talking to you, and can we have a conversation? And so I ended up making my number and everybody celebrating, but I said, no, here's my resignation that showed that you did not want me. I'm going to your biggest competitor.
Hmm.
So it was kind of like, okay, I'll show you. I moved out of Jersey down to Maryland and went to work for a competitor. And with this competitor, it's just like it was almost custom made for me. This company in Jersey did everything over the phone. The company in Maryland was a face-to-face, and they emphasized face-to-face. And so my territory was a combination of North Carolina and part of Maryland. I had a little bit of local, but also had a remote territory. And that first full year with that company in Maryland, I became their top salesperson out of 42 salespeople globally.
Hmm.
And I had achieved something that no other salesperson had ever achieved, which was $1 million of perpetual licenses. Today, $1 million, is average probably deal sizes for most companies. Back then, this was in 1991. No one had ever done it for this company. No one had ever sold $1 million in software, and it was an average deal size of less than 20K. So that was a lot of transactions, but things fell into place for me, and I was very fortunate to be able to figure it out and achieve success fairly early on.
Al, I want to circle back to getting sat down and basically, your boss saying, you got to hit this quota or you're gone. Your response to that, it strikes me a lot of similarities. It's almost like you ran the same play that you ran when your grandmother said, hey, you got to get your grades together or you're not going to be able to go to college. Was that a similar mentality that you that was a shot over the bow? I really got to get this figured out. And how did that kind of motivate you?
It was definitely a motivation. At times when you're slapped down by something that's out of your control, you really have two choices. You can sit and sulk and have a pity party, or you can sit down, grab yourself by your big boy boots and say, okay, how do I fix this? And that's just always been my mentality. There's been times when I've just had to grit it out. And I sat down, put a strategy together. I said, my first strategy was, okay, I've got to do everything I can to make my quota, but I want a backup plan. And that backup plan is I'm going to call our competitor and I'm going to tell them, just see if I can reach out and initiate contact and see if I can have a backup plan. Turns out the backup plan became the plan A.
Yeah, it seemed like that once you drew that line in the sand, things really started to click for you and you took off. You also mentioned, the importance of finding your passion. What would your advice be to, if somebody is listening and they don't really know what that is yet, what would your advice be to them in terms of how do they go about finding that for them?
Well, it's almost like chemistry when you're dating someone. When you're dating someone, you look in their eyes and you get that funny feeling all over, and you just kind of know, wow, I'm very attracted to this person. They're the one, not just a one, but the one. It's like that when you find your passion. It's not something that you can force. It's just something that you know it when you find it. And it's where your interests intersect with your abilities. And even if you don't have those abilities, like I alluded to earlier, when you don't have the outgoing nature, you don't have I didn't have the gift of gab. I had to re-engineer my DNA from an introvert to more of an extrovert. And I knew that I needed to be able to do that. Turns out that some of the best salespeople in technology anyway are introverted. And they listen a lot more than they speak. And that was one of the first lessons that I had to learn from one of my mentors that sat me down and said, yeah, you've got the gift of gab, but you got to learn when to use it. So I always appreciated any mentor that was willing to give me the tough love and be very critical and teach me the art of selling. And selling is both an art, but there's also some science that's related to it. And when those two things can intersect, it can be a beautiful thing. I was fortunate enough to be able to make my quota for the first 12 years of my career, and the 13th year turned out to be a doozy. Of course, that's when the bottom fell out with the .bomb era. A lot was going on in the outside world, but losing my job, or with the threat of losing my job, I actually ended up being ahead of that and quitting that first job where I was put on a plan. That was a big motivating factor because I didn't want that to happen again. I didn't want to be not in control with my livelihood being threatened. So that was a big motivating factor. And I guess it was a fear factor, but that very much played into the motivation going forward in my career.
Yeah. Al, you've mentioned a couple times about, people coming into your life who had a significant influence, a mentoring kind of presence, somebody there giving you advice. Was that something that you actively sought out, or was it just more happenstance that those people were there to advise you in those timeframes?
I think it was a combination of the two. Many of them were bosses, but some of them were peers, some of them just friends. And in your sales journey, you really end up taking a lot in putting it into your own book. So you can read books and you're not going to take every single thing that the book says to do, or take a training class, or even with mentors, it's probably the 10% rule. You're probably going to take 10%, but you carry your own little book of how you're going to do things. And you do learn from a variety of sources where we get our information from, and we learn from mentors. But I've always tried to keep myself open to coaching, to learning from others, especially those that have demonstrated success. And when you're through learning, you're through. That's always been my mantra. But I try to stay in a mode where I can make myself available for constructive criticism, and sometimes not so constructive criticism. Very much keep myself in tune with others that provide feedback and opportunities to learn. Even people that worked for me later in my career, I continued to learn from many of them.
Yeah. And, and Al, you mentioned too that, the .bomb kind of, and that's one of the things that the technology industry is, somewhat famous for, is the ebbs and flows of the investment cycles and VC and even changes in technology. So obviously you went through that once. Were there other times where you were on a good trajectory and then, the company blew up, or there was, something else happened that, created some disruption in your career?
Yes, back in the .bomb era, I was working for a company that hit the wall very, very hard. And I wasn't disrupted where I was pushed out, but I was given an opportunity to exit because they were reducing their force. And I was actually managing some people at the time and was not really liking the managing part of it because I was making less than people that were successful selling. But they didn't have an opportunity for me to go back into just an individual contributor role. So I took the opportunity to exit that company and really kind of regroup and figure out what I was going to do. And I got to say, it took me 2 times to get my footing again. One company was a shorter stint than I would have liked, but there were outside factors with the company being acquired, and also factors with just not meshing with a new manager in terms of their philosophy. They were very much like a snake oil salesman, and I definitely didn't mesh with that type of personality, lying and cheating, scratching, biting, all of those things. And it's like, no, if I've got to do that to be successful, I just don't want to be there. But I was fortunate enough to catch on with somebody that I developed a rapport and a friendship with. And that person was an exceptional IQ. And this person became a real mentor for me. And they started the company that I was with, Aptus. And we started, and I started when, as you had alluded to, as employee number 5. There were 3 co-founders, a developer, and then myself. And, we just started together with no funding. We bootstrapped this thing together, and they had developed a product that I was very passionate about. I thought, this has got some very unique attributes. It's solving a complex business problem. I think I can get my mind around this. Let's go out there and see what we can do. And it was just an itch that I had to scratch. I always wanted to be in an early stage startup, but let me tell you, that's careful what you ask for. There was no base salary, there was no insurance, and those were some tough times when it came to the money side of things. But I had saved enough to be able to be in a position to actually go forward and give this a shot, and it turned out to be a very successful venture.
Yeah. So Al, I'd love to, hear you color in even a little bit more detail what some of those early days were like. You kind of like this ragtag group of 5 people getting going, and you got an idea, and it sounds like they put together a product. But what was it like, walking in the door, no base salary, there's no sales happening, there's no existing processes or rule book in terms of how to go about things. What was that like for you?
Well, those were interesting times, and nothing in my career had really prepared me for that time. There was a demand for the product that we were selling. There was certainly a demand, and it was a very complex business problem that needed to be solved. And the product that had been developed had some very unique aspects to it. So that's what made me very passionate about it. And I put my head down, and every day, once again, faced with challenges because nobody knew about the company. There was no marketing. You get someone interested and they say, that's great. Well, who else is using this product? And you'd have to be 100% honest and say, well, we don't have any customers yet, but you're going to love it. And, we had to continue to sail through all of the early stage difficulties that go with, a brand new startup. Who are you there? And walking in that door, it was my own door. It was my basement. We all worked virtually. There was no office. And this was a company that was 100% bootstrapped, no outside funding whatsoever. It was an idea. It was a product. And the rest, my friend, was a blank sheet of paper. Go figure it out. And so I had a phone, a computer, and that was it. And I bought the phone. I bought the computer. I paid my own bills. I mean, this thing was bootstrapped again. So not a lot of luxuries on day one. At least I knew where the bathroom was because it was in my own house. But but let me tell you, if it was going to be, it was up to me.
Wow. So I mean, literally, I was thinking of the Steve Jobs garage story, but you guys didn't even have the garage,
Yeah.
We had 5 garages.
Exactly. So those early sales calls, I mean, I can't even imagine going out with, effectively nothing but, hey, we've got this great idea and we're working on the software package and trying to convince people to buy it. So, talk to us a little bit about those, those early sales calls, and how long did it take before, you got somebody to lean in?
Well, those early calls, interestingly, in those first 4 months, I don't remember the day or what month it was. All I remember was making a tremendous amount of calls, because that's the one thing I could control. I can control my work ethic, if you will. And so the other things, I can't control it. We didn't have much marketing, really almost zero. We didn't have, nobody knew who we were, but we had a pretty darn good product that had some very unique things about it. But it was up to me to get it out there, get the message out. So I remember one day getting a call from my local phone provider, and they said, "Mr. West, do you have an automatic dialer on your phone?" I said, "No, I don't," which was the truth. I did not. They said, "Well, sir, over the last 48 hours, you've made 1,000 phone calls and from this number, and we're going to have to upgrade you to the commercial plan." And I said, whoa, 1,000 calls, really? They said, "Yes, we're going to have to upgrade you to the commercial plan." I was like, wow, okay, that's kind of a bummer. First of all, I got to pay more, but for the same service. But I was like, really, did I just make 1,000 calls in the last 48 hours? I mean, holy smokes, I didn't know it was even possible with my finger, no automatic dialer. But let me tell you, I was hitting it hard, obviously. And I was not just working the 9 to 5. My wife and kids would leave for school at about 6:45, and I would just get tunnel vision in that basement. And I would work, because I could have the entire country at my disposal. There were many days where I'd work from 6:45 a.m., come back up for dinner, and promptly at 6 p.m. My wife was a gem for having everything ready. Kids went to bed at 7:45 like clockwork, and heading back down to that basement, and from 7:45 until 10 o'clock or after, many days, just hitting it hard. And just people think they work hard, but those are some of the hardest, working hard, if you will, defining that. For me, that was some pretty hard work, a lot of hours, but just muscling your way through it and finding a way. Once again, with a blank sheet of paper, we figured out how to get not only companies, small companies, but our fifth customer was Thomson. Before it was Thomson Reuters.
Right.
And it was a division of Thomson, and we got them to buy 1,200 seats of our product, and it was for $264,000, 3-year commitment, and then about $100,000 to implement the product. It was $1 million contract on our fifth customer, and that was in March. The company had launched in August, and we were profitable from that day forward until we took on outside money.
It must have been a hell of a celebration in the basement that day.
Absolutely.
It was a hell of a celebration in 5 basements.
So how long was it from, when you first started blank sheet of paper to making that sale? What was that time frame?
Well, that was our fifth customer. The first customer we actually landed within the first 30 days, and that was from an existing relationship. All the founders and myself came in with some existing relationships, kind of like changing a law firms. But once again, the first 4 customers were very small, under $10,000 in annual contract value. The fifth one that I landed, that was the big one. And once that domino fell, they started lining up. The big ones were easier to fall. The next one was Symantec. The one after that was Delta Airlines. The one after that was Alcatel-Lucent. We started playing with the big boys, and nobody wanted to be the first. But once Thomson fell, man, it was just amazing how the dominoes started to fall in a good way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm curious, going from that blank sheet of paper, one of the notes that, you seem to be a big believer in is learn to beat your competition and then make a repeatable process around it. Could you talk about what that means, and maybe even in the context of, in the early stages, starting from a blank sheet of paper, how you went about doing that when it came to Aptus?
Yeah, I will. And that kind of, there's a little bit of a detour in the story. And this is another part of adversity that I found myself having to deal with. So here we are in the first year of being with Aptus, no salary, no benefits, but you know what? I got commission off of that sale, and I got commission off the other sales, and all those that I mentioned, those were dominoes that I made fall. After Thomson, so Delta Airlines, Alcatel-Lucent, Symantec, those were deals that I closed, and they were starting to get sizable, and we had the wind in our sails. The company was profitable. It was bootstrapped, and things were going exceptionally well until I find out that my COBRA benefits from my last company were expiring, and I had to get insurance. So I called an insurance broker and said, "Hey, dude, I need some insurance. Hook me up." And he said, "We got a problem. I said, what do you mean we have a problem? He's like, well, your wife is not insurable. I said, what do you mean she's not insurable? He's like, well, this is pre-Obamacare, don't forget.
Right.
So he said, well, your wife is uninsurable because she had breast cancer, and that's a predefined condition. So that wasn't a quick fix. I actually had to leave Aptus, and it was the hardest thing I think I've had to do in my career, but it was a risk that I was not willing to take. So I left Aptus and went with a competitor of all things. I sat down with my CEO, one of the co-founders, and he said, I completely understand. You should go do this. Go to work stay in the industry, work for this competitor. And when we get insurance, you will come back as if you never left. And I said, well, I appreciate that. And it was 14 months. They were able to get their footing, go through a benefit aggregator and get insurance for everybody, not just myself, a group policy. So 14 months, but I went to work for one of their competitors and was successful with that competitor. Actually ended up selling a pretty sizable deal to IBM. And then IBM took an interest in buying that company as a result of that transaction. But, even though I was successful, made my quota, everybody was, high-fiving and President's Club and all that stuff. As soon as Aptus called again and said, hey, we're ready for you to come back, I dropped it like a hot potato and said, I'm leaving. And they were like, what? You're leaving? And I said, yeah, my allegiances lie elsewhere. So I immediately unplugged. But I learned the flaw, because the company that I went to work for was the industry leader, quote unquote, but I learned they had a fatal flaw. And I actually went in and used that fatal flaw and found out that other companies doing what we were doing had that same fatal flaw. So I built a playbook that said, hey, here's actually how you can blow up their demo because this is their fatal flaw. And it wasn't an easy fix. And so that helped make Aptus successful because the company where I was, and it helped to really be able to, now maybe you can look at that as being insider information, but it led to our success, knowing our competition at a deep level, exactly down to the point as to what would blow up their demos. So making that defined and repeatable at Aptus was a very big part of our success.
It's interesting. I'm reflecting right now on a client from years ago who was a fairly sizable player in the printer industry. And their biggest competitor was HP. And there was one thing that their printers could do that HP printers couldn't do. And it really wasn't a significant thing, but they actually trained their salespeople to go out and make a huge deal out of this particular feature and sell it like, you absolutely have to have this feature. And they literally planted objections for the HP salespeople when they came in. So they kind of did the same thing. Interesting.
It's very similar. And in technology, though, if you can blow up your competitor's demo, when I say blow up, multiple bad things happen. But if you can get the application to crash in the middle of the demo, and you know how to do that every single time, it can be a beautiful thing. It can certainly help you be successful.
Yeah, that makes sense.
A little bit of evil genius in that,
Or maybe a lot even.
So, Al, I'm curious, one of the things that previously you and David talked about that I'd love to hear you go into more, we talked about the early stages of Aptus, and you talked about the 3 phases of building a sales organization. You walked in, you're the only sales guy there, and eventually you're getting to a point where you're building a sales organization of, correct me on the numbers here, several hundred people. How do you go from one guy, blank sheet of paper, to all of these people now reporting to you?
So in the early days, it wasn't just myself. I have to give credit. There were 2 of the other co-founders who had somewhat of a sales background. They were actually marketing guys who thought they were great salespeople and learned how to sell. And I say that endearingly, but there were 3 of us that were selling, and we all worked together, and it wasn't just a singular effort in those early days. When I came back after my hiatus, and we really decided to continue growing the organization, but when you don't have outside money, it's very slow organic growth. So it took us 6 years to get to 87 employees. And because I remember it very well, this was the end of the CEO sent out a year-end email to all 87 employees in 2012. But times were good. We were profitable. We had several million in revenue, and we were growing at an astronomical clip. I mean, literally year over year, we were between 70 and 100% year over year growth every single year. But at the end of 2012, and this is 6 years into my journey at Aptus, we had 87 employees. And out of those 87, there were 12 people that were in my sales organization. I had a VP East and a VP West. And in that period of growth, I'm going to use an analogy that somebody else gave me. I give credit where credit's due. This is not my own analogy, but technology companies like this go through growth. And the very first phase, I kind of liken to commandos. This is the Delta Force. These are people that go behind enemy lines. They use laser pointers, and the B-52s come in and bomb the target. And you don't even really know that the Delta Force is there. They're really good at blowing up stuff and making things happen. And you go from those commandos in those early days to a little bit more of a militia. In 2012, we were kind of a militia. We were loosely organized, but not a lot of structure. But then in 2013, we took on some outside money, and we really hit the slipstream. As a management team, we all sat back and decided we can continue growing like we're growing, but we really, really want to go for it. I mean, there's a market opportunity here that we really need to more than double down. Let's go build a sales machine and really just swing for the fences. So we did that. And then we went from the militia we went to now more of an army. And building an army is just that. So let me define what that means. So we went from 12 merry band of lollipop men, as my CEO used to call us, back in 2012. 2 years later, the company's 1,000 employees. So this is the same end of year in 2014. CEO says we have 1,000 employees. My organization consisted of over 100 sales reps, quota carrying sales reps globally. And also, but you have all the sales infrastructure around that. So we had sales operations, sales enablement, sales engineering, the BDR, which is business development team, inside sales. All of these added up to around a couple hundred people. And so now we were definitely an army. And that period, those 2 years, was a period of growth that just really astounds me, because you think about your day and time management. Half my day was spent interviewing people to hire. And I kind of got away from, getting in front of customers or clients and prospects, and had to learn how to push things down to manage from a management perspective and become more effective at time management and really focusing on the most important things.
So was it just a controlled chaos? I mean, I can't even imagine when you have 87 people, you probably have a pretty good sense of what everybody's doing and how they're contributing and if they're, the difference that they're making. But when you grow from that to 1,000 people in the span of a couple of years, how do you even have a sense of what are all these people doing and some semblance of the, keeping control over the chaos just of the growth?
There was an awful lot of chaos. There were a lot of headwinds, but we also had, those are some of the best of times as well, because the growth in the company was stellar. I mean, well over 100% year over year. I think in one of those years it was 107%. Another year was 111% year over year growth. So being able to grow 100%, it was chaos. There were headwinds. And let me tell you, not everything was easy. So as the leader of this organization, the sales organization, you really have to stay ahead of those headwinds. You cannot manage in the moment. You have to iterate and stay ahead of where you are and always be looking to the next phase of where you need to go. Don't manage to the moment, manage to where you need to be. And that's my mantra. And that really contributed to my success and being able to grow and scale the organization.
You also mentioned, you're spending half your day, maybe more than that on some days, interviewing new candidates and recruiting. What were some of the things that you were looking for in people? And in particular, was it something that, one of the things that we've talked about for a big key to success for you was having that driver? Was that something that you were looking for in all of those interviews in terms of hiring new people?
Well, my mantra is if you do not know what your target is, you're never going to be able to hit it. So you have to truly understand what your target is from a hiring perspective. Really, that can apply to really any business target that you're trying to hit. You have to clearly understand what that target is. And interestingly, at Aptus, what we were looking for in the early days in a sales candidate changed over time. In the early days, we would never hire someone from the bigger companies like Oracle or SAP or even Salesforce for that matter, because coming from a bigger company into a scrappy startup, a lot of times they could really disrupt the commandos. They're not startup mentality people in many cases. So we would exclude a lot of those people coming from the bigger companies. In 2012 to 2014, during the growth in that growth period, that's when we started to bring in people from those larger organizations because we had the infrastructure to support them, and their DNA helped our DNA become more of a larger company selling to larger enterprises, selling larger deals. So it was really with foresight that we always refined our target based on where we were in time. So from a sales candidate's perspective, what may not have been a good candidate in 2006 to 2012 or 13 became a good candidate in that 2012 to 2014 period of time. So you're always iterating, always staying ahead of not managing to where you are, but where you need to be. So that also changed from a candidate profile. But in my hiring process, I've always tried to apply engineering, which was my college background, computer science, and taking all the advanced calculus and math, try to apply that engineering approach and bring control from chaos, bring order to chaos. So use that engineering discipline to try to put a process in place, even from a hiring perspective. So it started out with understand the target, what you're trying to hit, and then you manage to that target from a hiring perspective. So I always ask the same baseline questions to candidates that I would interview. And from that same question baseline, I was able to apply a numeric scoring and make a determination very quickly as to whether or not this person was going to fit what we needed. And I would ask situational questions versus questions around, did you make your number? How did you make your number? I would really get into situational questions because sales reps are really good at selling themselves and telling you what you want to hear. But when you get into situational, that's a lot more difficult when people have to tell you how they do something. It's more situational, and I've always used that approach in interviewing. And I make quick determinations based on the responses and measuring that against the target.
Mm-hmm. So Al, you mentioned that, obviously as the organization grew, the profile of who you were looking for changed. So what about the early commandos? Because you oftentimes hear about people who are, startup folks and they get disillusioned as the organization scales and grows and you kind of lose that startup feel. Were you able to hold on to those people, or did they, come to that realization and go looking for the next startup?
Some of them did, and some of them were able to evolve, iterate, and adapt. Remember, I was one of those startup guys.
Yeah.
I was the original startup guy. I mean, just 5 of us, and I was the sales guy. I mean, that's what I did. So I've walked a mile in those moccasins, and that helps from a leadership perspective because I could truly lead from the front. People would look to me to say, okay, how do we beat our competitor? Salesforce became a competitor in 2016. That was interesting times. I mean, we didn't tuck our tail and run. We actually grew 74% that year. So we were able to thrive even amidst, Salesforce climbing in the ring with you. And that's not an easy thing to do. And it doesn't just happen by chance. Once again, you reach down and grab yourself by your big boy boots and you say, okay, here's the situation. Now, what am I going to do about it? And the things that you can control, you control them. The things that you cannot, you don't even try. We couldn't keep Salesforce from entering our arena, but what we could do is find a way to beat them convincingly. And we were able to do that on a pretty successful run.
You mentioned a phrase there, lead from the front. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that and why it's important?
Yeah, I think managers are good at managing things like tasks and managing time and managing other aspects, managing people from that perspective. Some people are good at that. Leaders lead, and there is a difference. And leading an organization requires things like charisma, but once again, people are going to gravitate to someone who knows the way. And so knowing our domain, mastering our domain, I would say. I consider myself to have mastered the domain in which we were selling, and mastering meaning everything about the competition, knowing the competition intimately, how to beat the competition, how to articulate value. I mean, those are all key things that I was able to bring to the table and help my sales team achieve success. I mean, I wanted to be the person that if they brought me into a deal, they felt like this was going to help them be successful in that deal. It was going to be an asset, and a major asset. And that's how I tried to position myself as we got to an army. I wanted to be, if not the general, one of the high colonels at the table, and be able to help my sales team be successful.
I'm curious, when a company is small, when you're at 87 people, the culture of the organization it's relatively easy because you can get things done with a conversation in the hall. The charisma of the leaders, easily translates to the people. And so that it's a very tight knit culture, that kind of commando or, band of brothers side of things. But obviously, as you scale with each person you bring in, you dilute that down. So how did you quantify the culture and how did you really perpetuate that and kind of keep it where you wanted it as you guys were growing the organization?
Well, Dave, this is where Two Logicals comes into the story for me. I mean, I attended one of your training classes, and the old 90-10 rule. I'm probably only going to remember 10% of anything that you spoke in that 2-day clinic. But one of the things that really stuck with me was a definition of culture. And I loved your definition. I've used it many, many times before. It's in my DNA, so I refer to it often. If you can define a culture, then you might be able to actually influence it. And I loved your definition of culture being the collective dominant thoughts in the organization. And that's essentially what it is. And it kind of made me think of, this whole thing around your brand. Your brand is what you want everybody to think you are, but your reputation is what you really are. And culture has those two aspects to it. Your culture can be it's going to be what it's going to be. Those dominant thoughts are going to happen. You can influence it as a leader to a certain degree, but there are always going to be things that are out of your control, and the dominant thoughts of that organization are going to be what they're going to be. But when you can sit down and break it down and say, what do I want my culture to be? Then you can try to influence it. So one of the things that I focused on in our culture, and it was a subculture within sales. And one of the things that I tried to do was keep things light. And what I mean by light is not that I was a stand-up comedian, but I would try to inflect an opportunity to never forget the fun factor. And we're all human beings, and there were so many people that worked for me. I remember one individual that I'd hired back in 2010. This guy was so intense. I mean, just to be around him, you could feel the intensity. And but when you got him out of the work environment, sitting down after working hours and just having a fireside chat, he'd smile, he'd break a smile, and you'd be like, wow, you need to do that more in the work environment, because your intensity level is about to drive everybody around you crazy. And I would just try to use many opportunities to keep things light, instead of having things be so intense all the time. And that's one of the things that I wanted to inflect in the culture that I was building, the subculture. And there's a lot of things, though, that happen around you, outside influences, inside influences, that are going to change that culture. And, but when you talked about the DNA of the organization, what I call the DNA, it does change over time, and it has to evolve. And it's constantly evolving. That culture is, once again, the dominant thoughts of the organization. And every time you bring some new person in, they're going to bring some thoughts with them that may find their way into the mainstream. The challenge is being able to get everyone on the same page. And if you have dissenters, to sit down with them and just say, hey, you're changing our DNA to a way that we don't want. And you have to identify what the problem areas are. And that's not an easy thing to do, but sometimes it involves some very hard conversations. And sometimes you do lose some of those commandos. Some people that were great commandos do not make good soldiers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Al, you went through this incredible experience of going fifth employee in the company to over 1,000, managing a few hundred people. Obviously you have a lot of insight and wisdom in terms of companies that go through a similar journey to that, particularly, in the startup space. What mistakes do you see a lot of startups make either in the early phases or as they grow?
One thing that I would say about my personal experience at Aptus is in that hypergrowth period, I think all of us looking back, hindsight always being 2020, we would have pumped the brakes at least around 600 to 800. We were just growing way faster than we should have. So that's one aspect of it. There's lots of other lessons to learn, and the big ones, I guess, are there's nothing new under the sun. So most people either know or will figure it out, but it's to keep your focus and be able to adapt and change and be customer driven and really always be in tune with what your customer needs or wants, and don't just build something for the sake of building it. There has to be a rhyme and reason. And that's one thing we did a fairly good job at Aptus is everything we built, we ended up building many, many different solutions. And we started out with one, but at the end, there were actually 19 different, separate and distinct applications. They all seem to work together to solve similar business problems or a common business problem. But every time you build that thing out, make sure that it's solving a specific customer need. Don't just build it for the sake of building it. And then culturally, there's always, like I said, going to be things out of your control, but just do everything that you can to impact the things that you can control. And the things that you can't, you just got to let them go.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess on the flip side of that, are there some common attributes that you see, particularly maybe in early stage startups or the leadership teams that, startups assemble over time? Are there some common attributes there that you see, the successful ones, the ones that typically will make it? Are there some commonalities that those leadership teams will have versus other ones that seem to flounder?
From my perspective, I think that there has to be a clear mission for the company in terms of what their mission and objectives to accomplish that mission are. It needs to be clearly articulated, and it can't just be, hey, we want to rule the world and of software, whatever that world is. You have to have a clear mission. And in our case, it was doing something that had never been done before, believe it or not. And that a couple of different aspects of the company that helped to get everyone around in the organization charged up. It's always exciting to take on something that has never been done before. And that became part of our mission. And instead of just saying, well, we're going to do this, or we're going to be the leader in this space, we were able to say, you know what, we're going to do something that's never been done. And it was actually not just one thing, but actually a couple of different things. Number one, it was, we're going to do this because we're bootstrapped, and very few companies had been bootstrapped and had any level of success. The typical example of a Silicon Valley-based company was taking on outside money right out of the gate. This company avoided that for 7 years, and there were very, very few companies. We were in rare air when it came to those companies that did not take on outside funding and were bootstrapped. That was number one. Number two was the product mission and saying, you know what, we're going to create a new category. Gartner and Forrester and the other analysts that cover our space aren't even thinking about the world in this way. But you know what? When we're through with them, they're going to see the world the way we see it. And it's going to be revolutionary. And we're going to do that which has never been done before. And those two things really help to motivate and to help shape the dominant thoughts or the culture of the organization.
So, Al, I want to be respectful of your time, but I am curious. You had, seems like, a hell of a journey with Aptus. What's next for you?
I appreciate that. I think it's pretty simple for me. I'm looking to find lightning in a bottle a second time. And that's kind of an analogy, but to define that, first of all, I don't want to over define it. The dating analogy, you don't want to have too many things on that list, or you're going to exclude everybody from that list. And there's only going to be one or two people on the entire planet that would fit that list. So for me, I want to find an organization that desires and wants hyper growth in technology. That's the only thing I could ever see myself selling. It was technology, but also a business application that solves a complex business problem. That's just in my bloodstream. Selling to the enterprise, the business, not selling into IT. And really, that's it for me. I just want to find that organization that I can be passionate about. And I'll know the technology when I see it because it'll be in my bloodstream. It'll be something that if I can be excited, I can excite a team and I can excite prospective customers. So I'm looking for that next stage in my journey. And meanwhile, I'm consulting with some other companies to help them transform their business from more of a transactional sale to selling to the enterprise. And getting into enterprise selling versus transactional selling is a difficult journey for some companies, especially if you started out transactional and you're making that bridge to enterprise. So that's what I'm doing in the meantime.
Again, it comes back to finding your passion,
It does.
So, well, Al, if there's one thing that you would like people to remember from our conversation today, what would it be?
I think it would, a combination of find your passion, but also iterate. Don't stay in the moment, especially if you're in a hypergrowth or want to be in a hypergrowth situation. Iterate. Always be thinking about where you need to be. Don't manage for the moment.
I think that's such great advice. So many people, they we see it all the time. They so desperately cling to the status quo because, and you made a comment earlier about, how you changed your DNA. And I think, so many people, they forget that they have the power to do that, and thus they don't iterate. So I think that's a wonderful, wonderful lesson.
Yeah. Great way for us to wrap up. Al, thanks so much for taking the time to wrap with us today.
Thank you guys for hearing my story. I appreciate it.
This episode is brought to you by Mojo. Performance-enhancing services make people faster, smarter, and more effective as human beings. And Mojo is the world's most powerful. With Mojo, you can plan out your next move, tackle your next challenge, and accomplish your next goal. That's why people that use Mojo are in better shape, make more money, and have better relationships. And teams that use Mojo have higher performance, better cultures, and more talented people. So if you want to optimize your performance and well-being in 2022, try out Mojo risk-free at joinmojo.com. That's 14 days absolutely free at joinmojo.com.